The Spit-Covered Cobbler is the 18th episode of the third season of 2.5 Men. This is directed by Gary Halvorson, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. It's a pretty decent episode. It's definitely not one of my favourites, but we do have some good moments, and Charlie, interestingly, was the voice of reason, and that's been the case over the last few episodes, which is quite nice to see. It starts off with Kandi wanting to use Alan's toothbrush. Alan immediately says no, which I completely agree with, and he presents her with a whole pot of brand new, fully wrapped and sealed toothbrushes, which is quite nice. And then he needs to pee, but he doesn't want to pee in front of her, so she goes outside and sings the pee-pee song. It's not a bad way to start things off. Then, after the intro, Kandi is having car trouble, and Alan is helping her fix it, and when Kandi is still outside, Charlie asks Alan what his long-term plans are with Kandi. Now, Charlie telling Alan that he can't really have a long-term relationship with somebody as young as Kandi is very atypical of Charlie. I feel like Charlie wouldn't think of that for himself, which might suggest that he thinks more highly of Alan than he does of himself. Maybe I'm overthinking it, but that's certainly what I was reading into the situation, and I think Charlie was really brilliant in this episode. And the rest of the episode basically sees Alan struggling financially, not because of Kandi, but because of his unwillingness or inability to say no to Kandi. It is worth pointing out that Kandi doesn't seem to expect anything, but Alan still gives. And he can't afford or can't justify paying to repair her car because she paid next to nothing for it and it would cost thousands of dollars to fix it. So he said, as a kind of passing comment, it would make more sense to buy her a new car. And now it's very interesting that he said to the mechanic who was praising Alan for being with somebody so young, that it would make more sense to buy her a car, not for her to buy a new car, which was a really interesting choice of phrasing. And Kandi hears this and she thinks Alan's buying her a new car and she's really grateful for it. And then we actually learned in the opening scene that she had a problem with her tooth, so Alan has taken her to see his dentist. She's not on his dental plan, obviously, so that's costing him money as well. And then the next thing we see is Alan dragging out this jug of coins. And then, to make matters worse, Judith phones to discuss alimony. And it is pretty funny, but also, in reality, it would be a pretty horrible situation to be in. But when Charlie walked over and just deposited a couple of coins into the jug, it's not what I'd expected him to do, and it certainly made me laugh. And Charlie even said, you know, I could lend you money, and Alan's not having it. And unfortunately, he is not able to go and face Judith, though, because he doesn't really have the money to give her the alimony. So Charlie goes over, and Charlie was brilliant. I don't necessarily condone the lie, but I loved how he was talking to Judith, because as soon as Judith opened the door, she was going off on one about how useless Alan is, and Charlie basically told her, if you calm down and listen, I will explain to you what the situation is. And I love that. I love the fact that he was basically not putting up with any of her nonsense. And she interrupted him and he said, Judith, that's not listening, which I absolutely loved. And I don't agree with the lie, as I said, but he basically said that Alan's practice is falling apart, but he's too ashamed to say anything. And quite interestingly, Judith got really emotional. And I genuinely think that she still has feelings for Alan. I don't necessarily think she's still in love with him, but it's nice to know that since they were married for so long and spent so much time together, and he is the father of her son, that there is a feeling there other than coldness. Now, we do actually explore her feelings for him, I think, last season. I don't think it was this season. So we know already that it's not just complete hatred despite the way she acts, but it was nice to get another look at this here. And then in the next scene, Jake and Charlie are eating pizza, and Jake is fed up with pizza, and we establish why they're getting a lot of pizza. Alan is dressed in a pretty interesting work uniform. Clearly he is working for a pizza restaurant or something like that. And just as he's heading out the door, Judith arrives, and quite sweetly, she's come over to give him a check, just until he gets back on his feet, which is, she didn't have to do that. She really didn't. And I thought that that was actually a really nice gesture. Unfortunately, Kandi then arrives, and she says to Alan, and again, it's worth pointing out that Kandi is just oblivious to everything. So she's not doing any of this to be malicious or anything or to show off. But she says to Alan, boy, I love the new car you got me. And obviously Judith realised in that moment where the money has gone and why Alan doesn't have any money. And then the final scene, we end with Alan asking Kandi to move in with him. And we end on a bit of a cliffhanger, because it's unclear what's going to happen next. And I will say, I don't necessarily think it was Alan's invitation to give out, because it's Charlie's home. I know Alan lives there, but at the end of the day, Charlie would get final say on who lives in that house. So it wasn't really okay for Alan to invite Kandi to live with him, unless he'd at least spoken with Charlie first. But I think it's very clear to say that he didn't plan on saying that. It was very much a spur-of-the-moment thing, just like pretty much everything else that's happened between him and Kandi has been. So it's an interesting episode. I don't think it's ever one of my favourites, and I think that's largely because I'm not a huge fan of Kandi. I don't dislike the character, and I think April Bowlby does an amazing job with the character, but she's maybe not the most interesting. But nevertheless, I thought the spit-covered cobbler was still a pretty decent episode with some really interesting moments, and for me, Charlie was actually the most interesting part. Really enjoyed what he brought to this, and ultimately, I liked the episode quite a lot.